Hello everybody, welcome back to another Thomas Apologia video. In today's video, I'm going to be doing something that all good philosophers eventually do, and I'm going to attempt to debunk myself. Now, before I actually get into the arguments in today's video, I would like to clarify that I have not left my current position, which is contingentarianism, for the position that is advocated in the argument I'm going to give in this video, which is necessitarianism. And I will explain those terms in this video as well. Now, I'm producing this video in order so that I can get this argument out there and hopefully to be able to field more objections for the argument that I've created, so that hopefully I will be able to offer better responses than the ones that I have already given. So with any luck, there will be a part 2 to this video, debunking myself. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's start out by reading the syllogism that I have created. Then we will read the definitions of the terms and then the justification of the premises. So, premise 1 is that if God's will is indeterminate, then his will does not describe the contingent facts about the actual world. Premise 2, God's will is indeterminate. Conclusion 1, therefore God's will does not describe the contingent facts about the actual world. Premise 3, if God knows contingent facts about the actual world, it is for a descriptive content in his will. Conclusion 2, therefore God does not know contingent facts about the actual world, from conclusion 1 and premise 3. Now, before reading the justification of these premises, allow me to tell you the definitions of the terms at play here. An indeterminate or an indeterministic cause is that the cause, whilst being indifferent in itself, can allow for multiple possible effects. Indeterministic causes do not contain contrastive principles for why one effect comes about rather than another, but rather they do contain such a description that describes, contain such a description that describes its effects as actual. This will be very important to remember later on in the argument. A determinate cause. This is that the cause in its current state can only allow for one possible effect. A contingent fact about the actual world. This is a fact that is actually true in this world, which does not exist in every possible world. We should note that one does not have to be a modal realist for this to work, in that every possible world really does actually exist, but one just needs to accept that there are possible worlds which could possibly exist. Further, the term describe in this context, or descriptive context, is defined as anything intrinsic to God that contains information that denotes contingent facts. This term should be broad enough to encapsulate views of God's knowledge, such as the intelligible species being God's divine essence itself, or people that want to say that God has a propositional content of knowledge, or that he has a possession of a form without becoming that thing, or anything in God that bears some descriptive content. However, if one wants to ambiguate the language here such that it doesn't apply to them, we can just create a new argument with the language being applicable to their system, in that we just adjust the language in these premises to then just apply to their argument, and then we can just apply it to them. So what's the justification for the premises here? Well, premise 1 states that if God's will is indeterminate, then his will does not describe the contingent facts about the actual world. This is justified in that if God's will is modally indiscernible, and his will denotes facts about the contingent world, then those facts about the contingent world are also modally indiscernible, as they are denoted in his will, and God is not mutable. Further, indeterminate causes cannot contain contrastive principles as to why one effect comes about rather than another, without those contrastive principles determining that cause to determine its effect, as is noted in the work of Dr. Alexander Proust. Thus, if God's will is indeterminate, then his will cannot describe the contingent effects about the actual world as being actual. Premise 2 states that God's will is indeterminate. The justification of premise 2 is that if God's will only guaranteed one possible effect as a determinate cause, then necessitarianism would be true. However, necessitarianism is not true under this hypothesis. Therefore, God's will in being indifferent allows for multiple possible effects. As Aquinas says in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 67, the contingent differs from the necessary according as each is in its cause, for the contingent is in its cause in such a way that it may or may not result from it, whereas the necessary cannot be but result from its cause. Premise 3 states that if God knows contingent facts about the actual world, it is for a descriptive content in his will. In order to know contingent facts without importing a real relation from the thing to himself, and thus being mutable, God must know it in virtue of himself. God's intellect can't know this content logically prior to the will, however, for it would imply this argument. Premise 1. If God's knowledge is modally indiscernible and necessary, then the content of God's knowledge is necessary. Premise 2. God's knowledge is modally indiscernible and necessary. Conclusion. Therefore, the content of God's knowledge is necessary. Thomists such as Gavin Kerr, and even Aquinas himself, has avoided this argument by stating that God knows all things in virtue of knowing himself as the cause of these things. Thus, God knows contingent things via his willing them. These things, however, can't be known via an indeterminate will, as indeterminate causes do not possess descriptive contents that designate that its effect is necessitated by its cause. Listen to this example. If cause X causes Y indeterministically, then X can't possess a descriptive content of Y that tells it that Y must be its effect. It may contain a probabilistic content of possible effects, such as it may be 70% likely that X causes Y, then the 30% likelihood that it causes Z, but not a descriptive content that describes its effects as actual can be contained in X. Yet, for God to know actual contingent facts, this must be in virtue of a descriptive content that describes an actual effect, and not a possible or a probabilistic one. As Aquinas says in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 1, Chapter 66, quote, "Now God's knowledge of all things through their cause, for by knowing himself who is the cause of all things, he knows other things as his effects, as we proved above." Now that we've read the justification for the premises of the argument, let us consider some objections that some people may give. Objection 1. God's will is indeterminate. However, there are also determinate causes in him that may contribute to his effects. Response to Objection 1. Any determinate cause in God that can relate to the effects of this actual world would also equally relate to God's causing of any other possible world, such as ones that do not even exist. Thus, it would provide no further reason that relates to our world other than perhaps to increase the likelihood or probabilistic nature of it being produced, which still does not contain these contingent facts as actual. We must note that when a determinate cause contributes to an indeterminate cause's causality, it only limits probabilities and possibilities in its effects, but the indeterminate cause does not contain information that tells us that this effect exists. Otherwise, it would necessitate its effect as a deterministic cause. Thus, likewise in God, if deterministic causes contribute to his indeterministic will, it does not guarantee God any information regarding the existence of his effects that is not probabilistic in its nature. Objection 2. Premise 1 conflates logical and causal determination. Response to Objection 2. The type of determinism being causal will be conflated as long as the intrinsic descriptions in God's will are modally indiscernible, as that which is necessary and indiscernible will exist necessarily. Yet, if God's will describes his effects as actually existing, and that description exists necessarily and indiscernibly, then it entails that this is causally determinate, as the description of contingent facts can't be causally false. Objection 3. This argument presupposes the contrastive principle of sufficient reason, as God's will having descriptive content determining its effect uses this principle, but we reject this principle. Thus the argument does not follow. Response to Objection 3. The contrastive principle of sufficient reason states that all causes explain why one effect comes about rather than another. This argument, however, only states that some causes explain why one effect comes about due to their description. Further, indeterminate causes can be limited in the number of possible effects that can come about from it, and it's thus not inconceivable that a cause can be limited down to create only one possible effect, which would then be determinate. However, causes under this view are determinate because they have limitations on their causality, which can be understood as descriptive. However, if this is the case, then a denial of the contrastive principle doesn't mean that causes can't descriptively determine their effects, and thus does not refute the argument. Objection 4. Logically posterior to God's willing, his will then contains the information of that which it causes. However, his will prior to willing is indeterminate. Response to Objection 4. Either the will logically posterior to the act of willing gains this intrinsic descriptive property as a change, or this property is modally indiscernible, yet it just follows from a logical sequence in God. If this descriptive property is modally indiscernible and necessary, then it follows that what it describes must also be necessary. For as previously mentioned, if God's will only described one possible effect across all possible worlds, then only one possible effect of his will could come about. Thus, although the defender of contingentarianism can state that the argument equivocates on what it means by an indeterminate cause, all this does is switch this argument for a different problem, which is the alternative of necessitarianism. This also raises some strange questions as to the logical sequence of God's knowledge of actual contingent facts being after his act of willing, but hey. Objection 5. The argument treats contingent facts about the actual world as facts of knowledge that God has, but this is not the case. Response to Objection 5. To refute this objection, all we need to do is get the contingentarian to affirm that whilst they may say that God has knowledge of all contingent possibilities, he also has knowledge of which of these possibilities are actual. It would seem to negate some type of perfection about God's intellect if his divine ideas he did not know whether certain contingent possibilities were actual. Consider, for example, humans. We have the ability as humans to ascertain if certain essences have an esse, i.e. if things are actual. Yet, God would not have the ability to know these truths under this system, and thus it would seem that humans would possess a perfection of the intellect that God would not have. Further, this point would just embrace the conclusion of the argument. As Aquinas says in Summa Contra Gentiles chapter 67, quote, "Now, since God knows all things, as was proved above, he knows not only the causes of contingencies, but also that which may possibly hinder them. Therefore, he certainly knows whether contingencies be or not." Objection 6. Mixed relations allow God to know contingent facts, just as God knows that he is a saviour. Response to Objection 6. God knows that he is a saviour because he knows how he is imitable from all actual contingencies, such as the Israelites out of Egypt. However, God does not know, though, that he is a saviour due to any mixed relations, for mixed relations are virtual on the part of God to the creature. A mixed relation can't import some property from the creature towards God, for God knows these contingent facts by the terminus of his act of willing. Objection 7. God's secondary object of knowledge changes, but he doesn't actually change. Response to Objection 7. If God's knowledge of secondary objects is in some manner contained descriptively in him, then the distinction seems to be irrelevant to the argument. This would entail that if the secondary objects of God's knowledge changes, then so do the descriptive contents contained in the divine ideas designating contingent effects. For the divine ideas that designate contingent facts about the actual world, although known by an immutable species, which is the divine essence itself, can't be mutable themselves. Objection 8. The descriptive contents in God that designates its contingent effects are necessary conditionally, but not absolutely. As the angelic doctor states in Summa Contra Gentiles, chapter 67, quote, "Further, if every single thing is known to God as seen present to him, that which God knows is just as necessary as it is necessary that Socrates is sitting, from the fact that he is seen sitting. Now, this is necessary not absolutely, but conditionally." Response to Objection 8. This issue here arises from the fact that if the descriptive contents that designate their contingent effects are necessary in a conditional but not an absolute sense, then they must be mutable, as if God knew otherwise, these descriptive contents would have been different. but God is not mutable, and therefore they are known absolutely and not conditionally. Further, if I know that Socrates sits conditionally, it is because Socrates in his sitting causes a change in my intellect. But an appeal to a conditional necessity in God is the same way that it would change God's intellect. An appeal to God's immutability at this point would be a special pleading fallacy. Now, I'm probably aware that some Eastern Orthodox and some neoclassical theists that posit change in God probably would like to use this argument against Thomas. However, I think that there are other problems of modalistic and providential collapses that also apply to these systems. So, for example, if one wants to say this problem is solved by the essence-energies distinction, then as long as the energies are immutable, then one can just replace the word will in the argument with the word energies. Further, if one wants to say that God's energies are mutable such that they can change, thus the argument is solved, or a neoclassical theist wants to posit some mutability in God, one can respond by just denoting providential collapses in God from this argument. Premise 1. If God is different across possible worlds, there is either a determinate or indeterminate reason for this difference. Premise 2. God is different across possible worlds. Conclusion, therefore, there is either a determinate or indeterminate reason for this difference. Premise 3. If the difference is determinated, God can't be different across possible worlds, because then the way he intrinsically exists would be the only explanation of how he could intrinsically be. Conclusion 2. Therefore, differences in God are indeterminate. Premise 4. If an indeterminate difference in God contributes to his causality, then his causality is indeterminate. Premise 5. Indeterminate differences in God do contribute to his causality. Conclusion 3. Therefore, God's causality is indeterminate. Premise 6. If God's free will is intentional, then he controls which possible effect comes about. Premise 7. God can't control which possible effect comes about, as indeterminate causes don't provide contrastive explanations. Conclusion 4. Therefore, God's will is not intentional, or you may say not purposeful. Now, I can see that the controversial premise of this argument may be premise 4, so as this video is not exclusively about this argument, I will just justify this premise rather quickly. The justification of this premise is that either the indeterminate cause will be final in this chain that produces its effects as a proximate cause, or a determinate cause effected by the indeterminate cause ifs. If the prior, then God's will is ultimately indeterminate, although determinative causes may restrict the probabilities or possibilities effects that he produces. If the latter, then it follows that if an indeterminate cause altered the status of determinate causes after it in a causal chain, then the determinate cause is just an intermediary for the actual causality provided in the contributing indeterminate causes. And that would be the justification for that premise.